Tonight, let's slow everything down. Dim the lights, put the phone face down, get comfortable. You don't need to remember names, you don't need to stay awake. You just need to let history, or in this case, literary history pretending very hard to be real history, gently wash over you. Tonight, we're drifting into Verona. Not the Instagram Verona, not the wine-tasting Verona, the dusty, dramatic, emotionally unregulated Verona of Romeo and Juliet. Yes, that Romeo and Juliet. 2 teenagers, 1 week, several terrible decisions, and a body count that could have been avoided with a nap and a conversation. So let's begin. Slowly, calmly, and with absolutely no urgency whatsoever. Romeo and Juliet takes place in Verona, Italy, sometime vaguely in the late medieval to early Renaissance period. Shakespeare never pins it down, because why would he? Historical accuracy was more of a suggestion back then. Verona is ruled not by a king, but by vibes. Bad vibes. Specifically, the long-standing feud between 2 wealthy families, the Montagues and the Capulets. No one remembers why they're feuding. That's important. It's old, it's inherited, it's the kind of feud where everyone involved is tired, but no one is brave enough to stop. Basically, European nobility in a nutshell. The adults are angry, the servants are angry, the teenagers are bored, and everyone is armed. Right away, Shakespeare lets us know this story will not be chill. Street fights break out over nothing, people draw swords like it's a personality trait, and the city authorities are exhausted. The Prince of Verona, who exists solely to yell at people, threatens execution if the fighting continues, which of course solves nothing. Now let's gently drift toward Romeo. Romeo Montague, the boy, the myth, the human embodiment of emotional whiplash. When we meet Romeo, he is not thinking about Juliet, not even close. He is heartbroken over another girl named Rosaline. Rosaline does not love him back. Rosaline has chosen chastity, or space, or peace, or literally anything else. Romeo reacts like a teen who just discovered sadness for the first time. He wanders alone, he cries, he writes poetry about darkness, he talks about love like it personally betrayed him. This is important, because it establishes that Romeo falls in love the way people fall downstairs, suddenly, loudly, and without checking where he's going. His friends, Mercutio and Benvolio, are deeply tired of this behavior. Mercutio especially. Mercutio is the friend who uses humor as a coping mechanism. He makes jokes, he mocks Romeo's obsession, he talks about sex constantly. He is fun, which means he will not survive this story. Benvolio, on the other hand, is the calm one, the peacemaker, the guy who keeps saying, "Let's not fight," and is completely ignored. Together, they decide the solution to Romeo's heartbreak is to distract him. Their plan? Crash a party. Specifically, a Capulet party. Yes, the house of their sworn enemies, the family they are legally and socially obligated to hate. And Romeo is hesitant, not because it's dangerous, but because he had a bad dream. Classic Romeo. Still, he goes, because peer pressure, and because fate is already rubbing its hands together. Now let's float over to Juliet. Juliet Capulet is 13 years old. 13. This is not romantic. This is historically accurate and emotionally unsettling. Juliet lives in a large, wealthy household. Her parents are distant, her nurse is basically her real parent, and she has spent her entire life being told what she will do, who she will marry, and when. Lady Capulet, her mother, speaks to her like a stranger reading cue cards. Lord Capulet, her father, is controlling but inconsistent. He switches moods the way Romeo's switch crushes. At this moment, Juliet has not thought about love. She has not thought about marriage. She has thought about nothing at all, which is honestly refreshing. But her parents have plans. A nobleman named Paris wants to marry her. Paris is older. Paris is approved. Paris has the personality of damp bread. Lord Capulet says Juliet is too young, which is shockingly reasonable. Then he immediately invites Paris to woo her anyway, because consistency is for peasants. That night, the Capulet household hosts a grand party. Music, dancing, masks, teenagers making terrible decisions. Romeo and his friends sneak in wearing disguises, because, again, why not double down? And then it happens. Romeo sees Juliet. Time stops. The music fades. Shakespeare goes full metaphor mode. Romeo forgets Rosaline exists. She is erased, deleted, emotionally uninstalled. This is not growth. This is a reset. Juliet sees Romeo, too. She has no idea who he is, which makes him irresistible. They talk, they flirt, they kiss. Within minutes. At a party, surrounded by enemies. Subtlety was not invited. Then reality gently taps them on the shoulder. Romeo learns Juliet is a Capulet. Juliet learns Romeo is a Montague. They react by doing absolutely nothing sensible. No reflection, no pause, no maybe we should calm down. Instead, they decide this is destiny. Because teenagers love destiny. It removes responsibility. Romeo sneaks back into the Capulet garden later that night. Not to leave, but to dramatically lurk. Juliet appears on the balcony. And yes, this is the balcony scene, the most quoted, misquoted, and misunderstood moment in literary history. Juliet talks to herself. Romeo eavesdrops. Already we see healthy communication habits forming. Juliet wishes Romeo weren't a Montague. Romeo immediately reveals himself, because secrecy is overrated. They talk about names. They talk about love. They talk about marriage. Marriage? They met hours ago. Juliet, to her credit, asks Romeo to be serious. She wants honesty. She wants commitment. Romeo promises everything. Because, of course, he does. By the end of the conversation, they are engaged. Engaged. On a balcony, at night, after one party. Sleep well, everyone. The next morning, Romeo runs to Friar Laurence. Friar Laurence is a monk, a gardener, and an optimist to a dangerous degree. Romeo announces he is in love. Again. Friar Laurence is understandably confused. Weren't you crying yesterday? Romeo says this is different. It always is. Still, Friar Laurence agrees to marry them, not because it's a good idea, but because he thinks it might end the family feud. This is a recurring theme in history, adults placing the fate of political conflicts on teenagers. The wedding happens quickly, quietly, without parents. Juliet lies to her family. Romeo lies to his. Everyone lies to themselves. And for a brief moment, it feels hopeful. Then we gently drift back into chaos. Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, is furious that Montagues crashed the party. Tybalt is aggressive, proud, and extremely committed to violence as a lifestyle. He challenges Romeo to a duel. Romeo refuses because now Tybalt is family. He can't say that, so he just looks weirdly calm. Mercutio takes this personally. Mercutio fights Tybalt instead. And this is where things stop being poetic and start being inconvenient. Mercutio is wounded. He curses both families because he sees the truth. This feud is pointless, and it destroys everyone around it. Romeo, overwhelmed, reacts. He fights Tybalt. Tybalt dies. Romeo immediately regrets everything. The prince arrives. Again. Tired, done. Romeo is banished, not executed, which feels merciful, until you remember that banishment means separation. Romeo and Juliet spend one night together. One. Then Romeo leaves Verona. Juliet wakes up married, heartbroken, and 13. Her parents decide this is the perfect time to force her to marry Paris. Juliet says no. Lord Capulet explodes. He threatens her. He insults her. He withdraws affection. This is not unusual behavior for powerful men in history. It's just louder here. Desperate, Juliet goes to Friar Laurence. He offers a plan. Of course he does. A potion that will make her appear dead. She will be laid in the family tomb. Romeo will be informed. They will escape together. This plan relies on perfect timing, flawless communication, and zero misunderstandings. So naturally, it fails. Juliet drinks the potion. Her family mourns. The wedding becomes a funeral. Romeo never gets the message. Instead, he hears Juliet is dead. He reacts the only way he knows, immediately, emotionally, with zero verification. He returns to Verona. The ending unfolds quickly, quietly, tragically. And when it's over, the families finally stop fighting. Because nothing brings peace like irreversible loss. Romeo and Juliet become symbols of love, of youth, of passion, but also, quietly, of how badly adults can fail children. And as we drift onward, remember this. This wasn't destiny. It was impatience, pride, silence, and a world where teenagers were asked to carry the weight of generational hatred. So, let's breathe. Let's rest. And when you're ready, we'll float onward to another beautiful, avoidable, historical disaster. All right, if you're still awake, that's fine. If you're not, even better. Let's just keep drifting. When Romeo and Juliet officially ends, we're told the feud stops. The families reconcile. They promise peace. Statues are planned. Lessons are supposedly learned. And history, real history and literary history, loves doing this thing where tragedy magically fixes everything. It usually doesn't, but let's pretend Verona learned something. Just for tonight. Because what's more interesting is how everyone else behaved while this whole situation slowly collapsed in real time. Let's rewind slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice the background details everyone ignores. Because Romeo and Juliet is not just about love. It's about adults outsourcing responsibility and then acting shocked when things go badly. Take Lord Capulet. At the beginning, he seems almost reasonable. He says Juliet is too young to marry. He tells Paris to wait. This moment gets quoted a lot. People point to it and say, see, he cared. But then, he immediately throws a massive party where Paris is encouraged to flirt with her. So what he actually meant was, she's too young, but also, this is happening anyway. Later, when Juliet refuses to marry Paris, Lord Capulet completely unravels. He screams, he insults her, he threatens to disown her. There is no curiosity, no concern, no, why do you feel this way? Just rage. Which tells us something important. Juliet was never meant to choose. She was meant to comply. Lady Capulet doesn't help. She defers everything to her husband. She emotionally withdraws. When things get dangerous, she advises Juliet to forget Romeo and marry Paris. Not because it's right, but because it's safer. And that's a very human response. Now, let's float gently back to Friar Laurence. Friar Laurence is often treated as wise, calm, philosophical. He talks about balance, about moderation. Then he agrees to secretly marry two teenagers from enemy families without telling anyone. This is where we side-eye him. His intentions are good, his execution is medieval. He believes love will fix political violence. He believes secrecy will create peace. He believes teenagers are reliable messengers. These are bold assumptions. And then when things start to unravel, he doesn't stop. He escalates. Fake death potion? Sure. Complex escape plan? Why not? Single letter delivery with no backup? Absolutely. This is not wisdom. This is hope wearing a robe. Now, let's talk about Romeo again. Because Romeo doesn't grow. He just reacts. Everything he does is immediate. Emotion first, thought later, sometimes never. He falls in love instantly. He commits instantly. He kills instantly. He despairs instantly. There is no processing. And this isn't meant to make him evil. It makes him young. But Shakespeare doesn't soften that. Romeo causes real damage, and he knows it. After killing Tybalt, Romeo doesn't celebrate. He collapses. He calls himself Fortune's fool, which is poetic, and also a way to avoid responsibility, because Fortune didn't pull the sword. Romeo did. Juliet, on the other hand, actually develops. She starts passive, obedient, quiet. But after marriage, she becomes decisive. She challenges Romeo's despair. She takes initiative. She drinks the potion. She makes choices. Risky ones, desperate ones, but choices nonetheless. And that's why her ending feels heavier. Juliet doesn't die because she's careless. She dies because every exit closed. Now, here's something we rarely linger on: the speed. Everything happens in about 4 days. 4. That's it. 4 days from sad poetry to family tomb. Which changes how we should read everything. This isn't eternal love tested by fate. This is emotional whiplash in a violent society. And Verona, as a city, is complicit. The streets are unsafe. Weapons are common. Honor is fragile. Young men are expected to fight. Young women are expected to marry. No one is expected to pause. Even the prince only intervenes after blood is spilled, and even then his punishments are reactive. Exile, threats, no reform, just consequences after the damage, which mirrors how a lot of historical power worked. Now let's gently examine the ending again. Romeo arrives at the tomb. Paris is there. Paris isn't a villain, he's just there. He followed the rules, he sought permission, he mourns, and Romeo kills him. Not out of hatred, but desperation. Paris dies believing Romeo is a monster. Romeo believes Juliet is dead. Juliet wakes up to silence. Friar Laurence panics. He leaves. This moment matters, because when fear shows up, even the good adults disappear. Juliet is left alone. She sees Romeo dead, and she chooses. No potion, no plan, just finality. And that's it. Two families gather, they grieve, they reconcile, they promise statues, which is a very aristocratic way of apologizing. Now, let's zoom out. Why has this story lasted centuries? Why do we still talk about it? Because it isn't about romance. It's about systems. Family systems, political systems, gender systems. It's about how young people get crushed between expectations and silence, and how passion fills the gap where guidance should be. Romeo and Juliet didn't need better love, they needed adults who listened, cities that de-escalated, rules that protected youth. Instead, they got swords, pressure, and secrecy, which historically was very normal. This is why the story never feels outdated. The clothes change, the setting shifts, but the dynamics stay. Young people rushing toward meaning, old people clinging to pride, everyone insisting it's unavoidable. And so, gently, quietly, Romeo and Juliet becomes less tragic love story and more cautionary tale whispered too late. So as you rest, let that settle. Not the romance, not the poetry, but the soft, uncomfortable truth that most tragedies don't explode, they accumulate. One ignored feeling, one delayed conversation, one adult choosing control over care, and eventually, a very quiet tomb. Take a breath. We're not done yet, because next we'll drift into how history itself fell in love with this story, and why Europe kept repeating it in real life with crowns instead of balconies. But for now, just rest. All right, still drifting, still slow, no sudden movements. Now that Romeo and Juliet has quietly ended, you'd think the lesson would stick. You'd think Europe would collectively say, ah, yes, teenagers plus feuds plus forced marriage equals disaster. Instead, history nodded politely and then did it anyway. Repeatedly. With crowns. Because Romeo and Juliet didn't invent tragic love, they just packaged it neatly. European elites were already experts at turning young people into emotional bargaining chips. So let's float out of Verona and gently into reality. Real castles, real dynasties, real teenagers who didn't get soliloquies, just contracts. In medieval and early modern Europe, love was optional. Inheritance was not. Marriages were arranged early. Very early. Juliet being 13 wasn't shocking. It was standard. Royal children were promised to strangers before they could read, sometimes before they could walk. The logic was simple. Love fades, land doesn't. So children grew up knowing their bodies were political tools, their emotions irrelevant, their duty unavoidable. Which explains why Romeo and Juliet resonated so deeply. It wasn't fantasy, it was familiar. Now let's talk about feuds. The Montagues and Capulets hate each other for reasons lost to time. That's not lazy writing, that's realism. Most historical feuds began with something minor, an insult, a border dispute, a badly negotiated marriage. Then pride took over. Generations inherited the anger without the context. They just knew who to hate. England's Wars of the Roses? Basically Montagues and Capulets with better branding. The Habsburgs? They feuded with everyone, including themselves. France and England spent centuries fighting over land neither side could properly manage. And every time, young people paid the price, married off to enemies, trapped between loyalties, expected to fix what they didn't break. Sound familiar? Now let's gently examine another shared trait. Speed. Romeo and Juliet happens fast. Too fast. But so did many royal marriages. Negotiations could take years, but once the papers were signed, the wedding happened immediately. No adjustment period, no emotional preparation. One day you are a child in your father's castle, the next you're shipped across borders to marry a stranger twice your age. Juliet's panic, not unusual. Her resistance, rare but understandable. Most royal daughters didn't resist. They dissociated. They survived. and those who didn't comply were labeled difficult, sinful, or unstable. History has a long tradition of punishing girls for having opinions. Now let's pause on Romeo again, because Romeo represents something else Europe struggled with: young men and honor. Men were taught that reputation mattered more than restraint, that insults required blood, that backing down was weakness. Mercutio dies because of this mindset. Tybalt lives by it. Romeo tries to escape it, briefly, and fails. European history is full of young men dying over honor, dueling, feuds, challenges issued over words. Kings died because they couldn't walk away. Princes died because they had something to prove. Romeo is not an exception, he's a prototype. And now let's talk about the adults again, because this is where the story quietly screams. Every tragedy in Romeo and Juliet is preventable. Every single one. If the feud had ended sooner, if the marriage wasn't forced, if the letter arrived, if someone waited. History is filled with if someone waited. If someone listened, if someone cared more about people than pride. But power rarely pauses. Friar Laurence represents the well-meaning intellectual elite, the ones who see the problem but underestimate its scale. He believes rational plans can outmaneuver emotional systems. They usually can't. The prince represents authority without follow-through. He threatens punishment, but never changes conditions. This is also historically accurate. Rulers often punished outcomes, not causes. And families like the Capulets and Montagues, they represent entrenched power structures. Old, proud, stubborn. The kind that only change after loss. Which brings us back to the ending. The families reconcile because their children are dead. This is the oldest pattern in history. Reform after tragedy, never before. And that's why Romeo and Juliet isn't romantic. It's exhausted. It's a story about people who waited too long to care. Now, gently, let's shift focus. Because Romeo and Juliet didn't just reflect history, it shaped it. For centuries, European culture idealized this kind of love: sudden, all-consuming, destructive. Artists praised it, poets repeated it, nobles imitated it. People started believing that love should hurt, that intensity equals truth, that calm is boring. And that belief caused a lot of quiet misery. Marriages where drama replaced communication, relationships built on obsession, people staying in pain because it felt meaningful. Shakespeare didn't invent this idea, but he popularized it. And once something is popular, history runs with it. So as we lie here half asleep, let's reframe it. Romeo and Juliet isn't about dying for love. It's about what happens when love is given no safe place to exist. No patience, no guidance, no time. And time, as history shows us, is the one thing elites never give their children. So, breathe. We're going to keep drifting. Next, we'll gently explore how later centuries misunderstood this story entirely and turned it into a blueprint instead of a warning. No excitement, no rush, just the long, quiet echo of a lesson history keeps ignoring. All right, still here, still drifting. At this point, Romeo and Juliet should have been filed under warnings, right next to "don't marry your enemy's children in secret" and "maybe don't let teenagers solve generational conflict." But that's not what happened. Instead, the world read Romeo and Juliet and collectively said, "Ah, yes, that's what love is supposed to feel like." And that misunderstanding settled in very gently for centuries. Let's talk about what people remember from Romeo and Juliet. They remember the balcony. They remember the poetry. They remember the intensity. They do not remember the adult screaming. They do not remember the threats. They do not remember the social pressure, because those parts are uncomfortable. So, culture quietly edited the story. Romeo became a symbol of devotion, Juliet became a symbol of purity, and the feud became background noise. This is how tragedy gets romanticized, and history loves romanticizing tragedy. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Romeo and Juliet was no longer a cautionary tale. It was an ideal. Young people were encouraged to feel deeply, to suffer dramatically, to believe that love without pain wasn't real love. Which is ironic, because the actual story is about pain caused by everyone except the lovers. But nuance doesn't sell well. Now let's gently look at how this played out in real life. In aristocratic Europe, especially during the Romantic era, young nobles began framing their emotional distress as proof of sensitivity. Melancholy became fashionable. Suffering became attractive. People wrote letters about unrequited love. They dueled over feelings. They married badly because it felt meaningful. And families, the same families who arranged marriages, encouraged this behavior as long as it stayed poetic. But when love became inconvenient, reality stepped back in. Juliet's situation wasn't rare. Young women were praised for devotion until they resisted. Then they were punished. History is filled with Juliets who didn't have potions, just silence. Now let's slow down and talk about childhood, because Romeo and Juliet is also about how little childhood mattered. Romeo is treated like a man the moment he can hold a sword. Juliet is treated like a woman the moment someone wants her body. There is no middle space, no adolescence. This is historically accurate. Medieval and early modern societies didn't recognize teenage development. You were either a child or an adult, and adulthood came early. That's why Romeo's emotional volatility isn't addressed. It's expected. That's why Juliet's fear isn't comforted. It's inconvenient. And this is why the story feels so claustrophobic. There is nowhere safe to land. Now, let's float briefly back to Mercutio, because Mercutio is often remembered as comic relief. But he's something else, too. He's the only character who openly mocks the idea of romantic obsession. He jokes about it, he dismisses it, he calls it performative, and then he dies. Which is why Shakespeare is quietly saying something very bleak. In a world ruled by honor and pride, the people who don't take it seriously don't last. Mercutio's death isn't dramatic, it's abrupt, like many real deaths caused by ego. And his curse, "a plague on both your houses," is the most honest line in the play, because he sees it. This feud doesn't just hurt the fighters, it kills bystanders. History is full of Mercutios, people caught between power struggles they never asked for. Now, let's gently consider Paris again. Paris follows every rule. He seeks permission, he waits, he obeys, and he still dies. Quietly. off to the side. Because being compliant doesn't protect you in unstable systems. It never has. And this is another reason Romeo and Juliet endures. It captures how unfair hierarchical societies are. No choice is safe, no obedience guarantees survival, no rebellion guarantees freedom. Everyone loses something. Now, something else often overlooked: religion. Friar Laurence represents the church, and the church, historically, loved playing mediator. It believed it could guide families, states, and individuals towards harmony. Sometimes it could, often it couldn't. The friar's failure isn't malicious, it's institutional. He acts alone, without transparency, without accountability. This mirrors how religious and political institutions often operated: quiet influence, private decisions, public consequences. And when it collapses, the institution retreats. Friar Laurence survives. Romeo and Juliet don't, which is also historically accurate. Now, let's rest for a moment, because this is a lot. Not emotionally, we're keeping this calm, but structurally. Romeo and Juliet is heavy because it shows how systems fail softly. No villain monologue, no grand betrayal, just people doing what they've always done. And that's the scariest part. History doesn't usually end in explosions, it ends in exhaustion. So, when later generations turned Romeo and Juliet into a love story, they removed the exhaustion, they removed the waiting, they removed the pressure. And by doing so, they made the same mistake Verona did. They focused on emotion and ignored structure. Which brings us to the long echo. Because even today, people still say things like, "Love conquers all," "Nothing else matters," "If it's meant to be, it will work." Romeo and Juliet proves the opposite. Love didn't conquer anything. It survived briefly, and then was crushed by everything around it. So as you lie there, maybe half awake, maybe not, let that gently settle. Not as sadness, just as clarity. Because next, we'll drift into how modern adaptations kept repeating the same misunderstanding, changing costumes, changing settings, but keeping the same quiet mistakes. No rush, just another slow step through a story that never learned to stop. All right, still slow, still steady. At this point, Romeo and Juliet has stopped being a play and started being a template. And like most templates, people kept copying it without reading the instructions. As time moved forward, cultures changed, governments shifted, technology improved. But emotionally, very little changed. So when Romeo and Juliet was adapted, again and again, the surface changed, but the pressure stayed. Let's drift into the modern era, or at least closer to it. By the 20th century, arranged marriages were slowly declining in the West. Teenagers were no longer legally property. Love marriages became idealized. Which sounds like progress, and in many ways it was. But here's the quiet irony. Even as society gained more freedom, it kept the same expectations about love: sudden, total, life-defining. The only thing that changed was the setting. Instead of balconies, we got fire escapes. Instead of feuding families, rival neighborhoods. Instead of swords, guns, reputations, social pressure. West Side Story is the clearest example. Same plot, different music, same result. Young people caught in violence they didn't create, adults who failed to intervene meaningfully, love that wasn't enough to override structure, and audiences cried because the story still worked. Not because it was romantic, but because it was familiar. Now, let's pause and talk about why this story keeps working. Because Romeo and Juliet isn't actually about love at first sight. It's about isolation. Romeo is isolated in his emotions. Juliet is isolated in her household. Neither has a safe adult to talk to. So when they meet, they cling. That's not romance, that's survival. And history is full of people mistaking one for the other. Young royals, young nobles, even young commoners. When your world is controlled, the first person who sees you feels like freedom. That's what Juliet feels on the balcony. Not passion, relief. Someone finally asking what she wants. And Romeo? He feels chosen. After Rosaline's rejection, Juliet's attention feels like meaning. Neither of them is wrong. They're just unsupported. Now, gently, let's talk about something people rarely mention. Time. Romeo and Juliet don't have any. Not metaphorically, literally. Every decision is rushed because they believe time is against them. Parents will force marriage, exile will separate them, violence will escalate. And they're right. So they rush. And when people rush, they don't build foundations, they build exits. This pattern repeats constantly in history. Oppressed groups rushing reform, couples rushing commitment, leaders rushing decisions. Because when systems feel hostile, patience feels dangerous. And that's exactly how Verona feels. Hostile. Which brings us back to the city itself. Verona isn't just a backdrop. It's a pressure cooker. Public violence, weak enforcement, cultural obsession with honor. Everyone is tense. No one feels safe. And unsafe societies create impulsive behavior. This isn't a literary trick, it's sociology. Now let's gently revisit the ending one more time, because there's something subtle there. The families reconcile after the tragedy, but we're never told they dismantle the system that caused it. No laws change, no culture shifts, just grief. And grief alone doesn't prevent repetition. History shows us that. After every war, leaders promise peace. After every tragedy, reforms are discussed. But unless structure changes, new Romeos and Juliets appear. Different names, same roles. Which is why this story never ends. It just resets. Now let's float towards something quieter. The language. Shakespeare's language in Romeo and Juliet is beautiful, soft, musical. And that beauty is part of the problem. It makes dysfunction sound poetic. Pain becomes lyrical. Desperation becomes romantic. This isn't Shakespeare's fault. It's the audience's choice. We like beautiful sadness. It feels meaningful without requiring action. And history loves that. Memorials instead of reform. Poems instead of protection. Statues instead of systems. Remember those statues at the end? Gold ones. Very expensive. Very symbolic. Very late. Now, let's gently examine Juliet again, because Juliet is often praised as brave, and she is. But bravery was her only option. Compliance meant erasure. Resistance meant punishment. The potion was a gamble, not a rebellion. And that's important. Juliet isn't empowered. She's cornered. And when we romanticize her choice, we risk romanticizing desperation. History does this a lot with women, calling survival strength, calling silence grace, ignoring the lack of alternatives. Juliet didn't want to die. She wanted time. She wanted choice. She wanted someone to slow everything down, which no one did. Now, gently, let's return to Romeo one last time. Romeo isn't a hero. He isn't a villain. He's a boy raised in a violent culture who mistakes intensity for purpose. And history is full of Romeos. Young men taught to feel deeply but act recklessly, praised for passion, punished for hesitation. Romeo's tragedy isn't love, it's lack of guidance. And when guidance is missing, people improvise. Badly. So as this part drifts to a close, let's sit with that. Romeo and Juliet didn't fail because they loved too much. They failed because they were alone in a world that demanded obedience, speed, and silence. And that world, it wasn't unique to Verona. It was everywhere. Still is, sometimes. So breathe. No lesson to memorize. No moral to announce. Just a quiet recognition that some stories aren't meant to be copied. They're meant to be understood, slowly, and then gently set down. When you're ready, we'll drift one step further into how this story quietly shaped how we talk about love today, even when we think we've moved past it. No rush, just rest. All right, still breathing, still floating. At this point, nothing dramatic is going to happen. That already happened. Now we're just watching the ripples move outward, slowly, almost politely. Because one of the most lasting effects of Romeo and Juliet isn't the story itself, it's the language it gave us. Before this play, love was often described as duty, alliance, stability. After this play, love became intensity, fire, madness, loss of control. And once language changes, behavior follows. Romeo doesn't just love Juliet, he burns for her. He dissolves into her. He loses himself. Juliet doesn't just care, she risks everything. She abandons identity. She chooses love over survival. And this framing became addictive because intensity feels real. Calm doesn't. History didn't just adopt this idea, it taught it. Poetry, novels, plays, they all echoed the same message. If it doesn't hurt, it's not love. If it doesn't consume you, it's not deep. If it costs everything, it's not meaningful. This is Romeo and Juliet's longest shadow, and it's a quiet one. Now let's gently look at how this affected real people, especially young people. Teenagers already feel everything intensely. Their emotions are new, unfiltered, unregulated. Romeo and Juliet didn't create teenage intensity. It validated it. It told young readers, yes, this is what love feels like. Yes, this chaos is important. Yes, this urgency is destiny. And for centuries, that message went unchallenged. Adults loved the story because it felt poetic. Young people loved it because it felt accurate. No one stopped to ask whether accuracy meant health. Now let's pause on something subtle. Romeo and Juliet never talk about the future. Not really. They talk about now, about feeling, about escape. They don't talk about money or daily life or disagreement. There is no after. And that's not a flaw. It's a clue. Their love exists only in crisis, which is why it collapses when the crisis peaks. History shows us this pattern constantly. Relationships formed under pressure feel intense, but struggle in stability. Wars create fast bonds. Oppression creates urgency. Fear accelerates attachment. And when things slow down, the bond either deepens or disappears. Romeo and Juliet never get the chance to slow down, which is why their love remains frozen in intensity forever. That's convenient for poetry, not for life. Now, let's gently drift toward how this story shaped expectations. For a long time, especially in Western culture, people were taught to wait for love to feel like this: sudden, overwhelming, transformative. And when it didn't, they felt something was wrong. They felt bored, unsatisfied, unchosen. Calm love felt fake. Stable love felt dull. This is Romeo and Juliet's quiet influence. It didn't ruin love. It raised the volume too high. Now let's bring this back to history again, because elites loved this narrative. Why? Because it kept people distracted. If love is destiny, then injustice is background noise. If suffering is romantic, then reform can wait. This isn't cynical, it's structural. History is full of systems that survived because people were busy feeling instead of organizing. Romeo and Juliet became a safe tragedy, something to cry over instead of something to change. Now let's gently revisit the ending, again, but from a different angle. The families promise peace, but they don't apologize to their children. They don't acknowledge pressure. They don't reflect publicly. They build statues. This matters, because memorialization often replaces accountability. History does this constantly. After tragedies, we remember, we mourn, we build monuments, but we rarely ask why children had to die for adults to learn anything. Romeo and Juliet fits perfectly into that pattern. Beautiful memory, delayed insight. Now, something else that often gets overlooked. Juliet is 13. Romeo is likely around 16 or 17. Their brains are still developing. Impulse control is limited. Risk assessment is immature. Modern psychology explains this clearly. History ignored it, and literature romanticized it. This is not an attack on the characters. It's an observation about expectations. They were never given tools, just consequences. Now let's slow down even more, because this is the part where everything quiets. Romeo and Juliet has lasted because it's simple. Two people, one love, one obstacle. But life is not simple, and history rarely is. The real tragedy isn't that they died, it's that everyone saw it coming. Every character senses danger. Dreams warn. Omens appear. Anxiety hums constantly. And still, nothing changes. Because momentum is powerful. Feuds continue because they always have. Marriages are forced because they always were. Violence escalates because no one stops it early. History doesn't collapse suddenly. It drifts, just like this. So as this part gently fades, let's rest with one final thought. Romeo and Juliet didn't teach us how to love. It taught us how easily love gets crushed when speed, pride, and silence surround it. And that lesson was never meant to be exciting, just clear. When you're ready, we'll drift into the final stretch, where everything settles, and the story becomes very quiet indeed. No rush. Just sleep. All right, we're near the gentle close now. No sudden movements, no dramatic revelations, just the soft, slow drift toward the end. Romeo and Juliet, as a story, concludes with death. Quiet. Inevitable, almost courteous in its finality. Romeo drinks the poison. Juliet awakens. She sees him dead. She takes her own life. No speeches, no grand gestures, just finality. Friar Laurence exits. The families gather. They lament. They promise peace. And that's it. Notice what isn't there. There are no lessons articulated, no societal reforms, no sudden clarity that prevents recurrence. Just grief, just reflection, just the faint echo of mistakes. And that's why this story resonates so softly, so persistently, because history rarely teaches through fireworks. It teaches through accumulation, through quiet inevitability, through gentle consequences that unfold slowly until everything has changed and no one notices until it's too late. Romeo and Juliet did not die heroically. They did not die meaningfully. They died as all constrained youth do when they are left to navigate adult systems that refuse to bend. The families reconcile. They erect statues. They mourn. They remember. But the systems, the pressures, the expectation of instant, intense, consuming love, that continues. It continues in literature, in theater, in every adaptation that tries to make passion seem eternal. It continues in history, in families, in societies, in governments. And quietly, softly, it continues in us. When people still rush toward feeling over thought, when decisions are made for appearances instead of care, when silence replaces conversation, Romeo and Juliet becomes not a story of doomed love, it becomes a mirror, a gentle, slightly uncomfortable reflection of human tendencies. And if we lean into that reflection, if we rest with it for a while, we notice something calming. There is no need to rush, no need to recreate the tragedy, no need to glorify desperation. All we need is patience and quiet understanding, and perhaps the smallest acknowledgement that history, literary, cultural, or human, is often more about observing than acting. So let's rest here. Think of Verona not as a city of drama, but as a gentle warning. Think of Romeo and Juliet not as lovers to emulate, but as teenagers to watch over. Think of adults in the story not as villains, but as reminders that care delayed becomes grief. And with that, let the story settle. Let the lessons wash over you slowly, like the softest echo of a bell in a quiet town. No urgency, no excitement, just the lingering, peaceful understanding that some stories are meant to be watched and then gently set aside. Rest. The streets of Verona are quiet now. The tomb is silent, and for once, even the restless hearts of teenagers can pause. Good night. All right, we're in the final drift now. The lights are dim, your mind is soft, and Verona, well, it rests. Romeo and Juliet's story doesn't end with them. It ends with echoes, ripples through literature, ripples through society, ripples through the quiet corners of history where nothing is recorded, but everything feels the same. Because every time a young couple falls in love too fast, every time adults ignore warnings, every time systems fail quietly, Verona rises again. Let's gently examine those echoes. In literature, the story became blueprint. Every doomed love thereafter borrowed from it, or adapted it, or misread it entirely. Tragic romances proliferated in novels and plays. Some added deaths, some removed them, some tried to modernize the pain, but the essence stayed. Young, passionate, constrained, desperate. The system closes in, the lovers collapse. In real life, the influence was quieter, less obvious, more pervasive. Teenagers in schools, cities, villages, all over Europe absorbed the message subliminally. Love should be urgent. Love should be total. Love should be dramatic. Love should hurt. And when it didn't, something felt missing. Societies reinforced it. Elites celebrated the intensity of feeling. Artisans depicted it in paintings. Poets wrote endless sonnets. Even in music, suddenness, longing, and forbidden love became hallmarks. And what is left unsaid is that this normalization subtly influenced expectations, which brings us back to Verona and back to the tragedy of inaction. All the deaths could have been avoided. All the heartbreak could have been mitigated. All the mistakes could have been intercepted. But systems are slow. Systems prioritize tradition over care. Systems delay, excuse, and sometimes
Romeo and Juliet whispers the answer, gently, without alarm, without theatrics. It whispers, watch, wait, listen, intervene before it's too late. And maybe, if we lean into that whisper, we understand why the story endures. Not for its poetry, not for its romance, not for the deaths themselves, but for its quiet, patient reflection on human systems, on the ways pride, secrecy, and silence crush those with the least power, on the inevitability of consequence when care is delayed. This is the story's true gift. And now, as we settle fully into the gentle end, let's remember the calm, enduring lesson. Tragedy is not sudden. It is slow. It is cumulative. It is quiet. And it waits for those who fail to notice. So breathe. Let your thoughts drift. Let the streets of Verona fade. Let the tomb remain silent. Let Romeo and Juliet exist not as a call to passion, but as a soft caution. And with that, good night. Sleep gently. Now, if you're still awake or half awake, that's perfect. Let's drift into the machinery behind Verona's tragedy. Romeo and Juliet doesn't occur in a vacuum. The city itself and its social structure quietly nudges every choice. Violence is normal. Honor is currency. Parents wield power like a club. No one is free, and so small acts ripple. A slight insult in the street leads to a duel. A marriage arrangement leads to secrecy. Secrecy leads to disaster. The city isn't evil. It's simply structured in a way that amplifies human impulsiveness. Notice how modern readers often overlook this. They see romance. They ignore the pressure cooker. But it's there, subtle, persistent, and it quietly guides every action. Let's slowly float to historical parallels. Teenagers constrained by adults, families that control futures, societies that prioritize reputation over well-being. Sound familiar? Throughout history, royal children often married before they were ready. Consider European dynasties, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons. Young people were not allowed to feel, hesitate, or reflect. They were instruments of alliance. And what happens when emotion meets restriction? Impulses spike, risk-taking increases, secret plans abound. Romeo and Juliet is fiction, but it mirrors the lived reality of countless teenagers in history. And it's worth pausing here, because this isn't dramatic, it's subtle, and yet it quietly shapes everything that follows. Now, slowly, let's consider memory. After tragedy, humans build monuments. Romeo and Juliet ends with the promise of statues. And here's the thing. This is a pattern repeated in real life. After disasters, families and governments create memorials. They erect statues, they write books, they commemorate. But do they fix what caused the problem? Rarely. Verona is symbolic. Its tombs are cautionary, but only in retrospect. The adults live on, systems endure, and the young people remain warnings. This subtle pattern is everywhere, not just in literature, but in history. Let's gently explore a quiet cultural effect. Romeo and Juliet teaches intensity. It teaches urgency. It teaches that love must consume. This is not trivial. It shapes cultural expectations. For centuries, literature told young people that calm affection is boring. Stable love is insufficient. True love requires risk, desperation, and occasional catastrophe. And while this makes great stories, it also normalizes suffering. We learn to equate passion with pain, desperation with authenticity. This is subtle, it's quiet, it's pervasive, and it's still present in modern storytelling, quietly guiding emotional perception. Now, let's float into the long shadow. Romeo and Juliet didn't just influence Shakespeare's time, it influenced centuries. Every adaptation, from operas to musicals to teen dramas, keeps the same structure. Young people caught in restrictive systems, adults failing to intervene, love rushing toward crisis. West Side Story, Romeo must die. Every variation keeps the core, and that's instructive. It's a reminder that stories don't just reflect life, they encode it, and the encoded patterns repeat across generations. Quietly, slowly, persistently. Finally, let's drift into responsibility. What does Romeo and Juliet ask of adults? What does it ask of society? It asks only one thing. Notice, listen, intervene before grief becomes irreversible. And that's a soft lesson.
Because no one slowed things down. And as we rest with that thought, let it gently settle, quietly, without fanfare. This is the enduring whisper of the story. Patience, care, observation, and the recognition that sometimes the quietest failures are the deadliest. Verona is a template, a model for every society where rules, pride, and tradition override care. The streets are narrow, the families are entrenched, violence is routine, authority exists but acts inconsistently. In history, this pattern repeats everywhere. Medieval towns where guilds controlled opportunities, royal courts where alliances dictated life, feudal villages where disputes escalated because no neutral party existed. Verona whispers, Pressure doesn't need to be loud. It can be structured, subtle, persistent, and it can quietly crush the unprepared. Notice the soft inevitability. Nothing in Verona is sudden. Everything accumulates. Every minor decision nudges the story forward, and that's what makes it so eerily familiar to history. Let's drift toward the youth of the story. Romeo and Juliet are teenagers, and this is key. Their brains are developing. Their judgment is limited. Impulse often outweighs logic. History is filled with similar patterns. Young nobles married early. Teenagers inherited power too soon. Emotions were weaponized, sometimes intentionally. And yet, we romanticize the mistakes of youth. Juliet's potion, Romeo's rash choices. Both are desperate attempts to reclaim autonomy, not acts of genius. And that pattern appears throughout history. Adolescents improvising solutions when adults fail to provide guidance. Systems demand obedience, and failure feels like the only option. This isn't drama. It's recurring, quiet human behavior. Now, let's float over to the adults again. Friar Laurence, the prince, Lord and Lady Capulet. None are villains in the traditional sense. None are entirely cruel. They are absent, reactive, cautiously ineffectual. And history is full of similar figures. Rulers who punish after the fact. Guardians who defer decisions. Institutions that hope for the best and rely on luck. In Verona, in history, consequences quietly accumulate until they cannot be avoided. And that's the most subtle kind of tragedy. Not sudden betrayal, not violent upheaval, but slow, structural failure. Why has Romeo and Juliet endured for centuries? Not because of its poetry, not because of its romance, because it encodes universal patterns. Young people pressured by adults, systems that reward pride over care, love rushed into crisis, adults intervening too late. This is timeless. It occurs in any society, in any century. And the story quietly teaches this pattern without raising its voice. It doesn't scream, it drifts, it accumulates, it whispers. And humans, for centuries, have listened. Couples rushed together, families creating pressure, authority figures failing to act, tragic outcomes romanticized. Modern adaptations often change settings, names, and costumes. The core tension remains: youth versus system, desire versus duty, impulse versus consequence. And audiences still resonate because the pattern is still familiar. We may live in different cities, in different cultures, we may have fewer arranged marriages, we may have laws protecting teenagers, but the emotional dynamics persist. Systems still constrain choices, pressure still accumulates, tragedy still quietly happens. Finally, let's rest in the quiet conclusion. Romeo and Juliet, as a story, is more than a quay. It is a slow reflection on human systems, on constrained youth, on adults who fail softly, on consequences that accumulate without fanfare. It's not about romance. It's about inevitability. It's about structure, timing, and human imperfection. As we gently close this long reflection, let's note, love is not always dramatic. Systems are not always obvious. Tragedy is often slow. And stories like this, they endure because they observe, not because they excite, not because they entertain, but because they reflect patterns we recognize quietly in ourselves and in history. Breathe. Let it settle. Let the streets of Verona fade to silence. Let Romeo and Juliet exist as gentle warnings, and let the long, slow lessons drift over you, softly, persistently, like the quietest of good nights. Now, let's drift into something quieter. Romeo and Juliet simply dramatizes the same pattern. And the quiet irony is that the cost of feeling is what makes emotion memorable. It's not the intensity itself, it's the consequences. Next, we float gently toward miscommunication. Letters lost, messages delayed, intentions misunderstood. Romeo and Juliet hinges on these quiet failures, and history is full of them. Missed letters in royal courts, delayed orders in bureaucracies, half-formed instructions that cause entire dynasties to act incorrectly. The mechanism is subtle, unremarkable, but the consequences ripple outward. And this is what makes the story timeless. It's not an isolated tragedy. It's a microcosm of systemic imperfection. Now, gently, let's acknowledge the role of chance. Fortune is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, incremental. Romeo happens to see Juliet. Friar Laurence happens to devise a plan. The letter fails to reach Romeo. These are small coincidences with enormous outcomes. And history, too, is shaped this way. A messenger delayed by rain, a misread order, a single misstep in judgment. Romeo and Juliet reminds us that sometimes the smallest details quietly define fate. Now let's drift to consequences over time. The deaths in Verona do not merely affect the lovers. They shape families, they shape neighbors, they shape generations. History mirrors this pattern. Wars ripple across decades. Political mistakes echo across centuries. Tragedies leave soft but persistent shadows. Romeo and Juliet is small in scale, but symbolically it models how impact accumulates quietly. No explosions, no headlines, just consequences slowly settling. Let's float into culture. Every society reads the story differently. Every generation remakes it. And yet, the core patterns persist. Youth constrained by elders. Decisions made without reflection, systems prioritizing pride over care, love rushed, misunderstood, and tragically constrained. The story adapts, but it never loses its whispering lesson. Human systems are subtle, persistent, and quietly consequential. Now, gently consider the conflict between ideals and reality. Romeo and Juliet is often celebrated as the pinnacle of romantic passion, but real-life parallels reveal a quiet truth. Love in reality is messy, slow, negotiated, sometimes disappointing. The play exaggerates intensity, it compresses time, it amplifies consequences, and in doing so, it teaches not romance, but caution. Let's pause to reflect on agency. Romeo and Juliet exercise as much autonomy as their society allows, which is to say, very little. Juliet cannot openly resist her parents. Romeo cannot ignore social expectations. Friar Laurence cannot manipulate every outcome. And this mirrors historical reality. Many young people throughout history had limited choice. Marriage, labor, mobility, even thought were constrained. The tragedy is not passion itself, but lack of room to maneuver. Now we drift into quiet patterns of violence. Feuds in Verona escalate through small gestures, insults, duels, and accidental confrontations, and this is a historical reality. Small provocations often led to disproportionate outcomes in societies without formal law enforcement. Honor culture meant insult could not be ignored. Even small slights demanded response. Romeo and Juliet encapsulates this. Death is quiet, not heroic, not glorious, just the result of social expectation combined with inaction. Now let's slowly examine the reconciliation at the end. The Capulets and Montagues promise peace. They erect statues. They mourn. But subtlety matters. The structures that caused tragedy are largely untouched. Patterns remain. Feuds could recur. Authority could fail again. This mirrors history. Grief motivates reflection, sometimes action, but often systems persist quietly. The lesson is reconciliation is gentle, rarely perfect, often symbolic. Finally, we drift to the ultimate conclusion. Romeo and Juliet is less a love story than a mirror, a quiet reflection on human behavior. Youth constrained by elders, systems slow to respond, consequences accumulating quietly, love misunderstood, rushed, and constrained. Its power lies in observation, not drama, not spectacle, not excitement. It teaches softly, notice early, intervene kindly, value patience. And as we slowly drift to the very end, let us leave Verona in silence. Let Romeo and Juliet remain as a whisper, a gentle caution, a soft reflection on how small failures quietly shape lives. Breathe, rest, and let the story settle, slowly, persistently, and finally into calm. Now, let's float into how the story influenced behavior quietly. Romeo and Juliet didn't just entertain.
It shaped expectations of love, urgency, and risk. Generations absorbed the message without noticing. If love doesn't feel all-consuming, is it even real? If urgency isn't present, does desire matter? If systems fail, tragedy is inevitable. This influence is subtle. It doesn't shout. It seeps into literature, social norms, and the way humans quietly judge their own emotions. History loves repetition. Verona isn't unique. Romeo and Juliet isn't unique. Patterns recur. Youth trapped by adult decisions. Decisions delayed until disaster occurs. Small miscommunications leading to catastrophe. Societies mourning too late. Quiet repetition teaches without fanfare, and humans, surprisingly, rarely learn the first time. Let's float gently toward the emotional economics of the story. Romeo and Juliet equates love with risk, but it's more than dramatic license. Historically, young people in constrained systems often face similar dynamics. Emotional risk carries social cost. Physical action carries consequences beyond understanding. Choices are compressed in time, heightening perception. The play amplifies this. It compresses days into hours, minutes into lifetimes, and that compression teaches a subtle truth. When systems pressure humans, every decision feels weighty, urgent, and potentially irreversible. Now let's consider adult authority. Friar Laurence is well-intentioned. The prince is cautious. The Capulets and Montagues are proud. All are human. All fail softly. History is filled with similar figures, rulers, mentors, and guardians who intend well but act too late. Romeo and Juliet gently demonstrates even good intentions are powerless against slow-moving social structures. Letters, messages, whispered secrets. Romeo and Juliet relies on fragile communication, and history mirrors this. Miscommunication is often the quiet engine of tragedy, a letter delayed, lost, or misread, a warning ignored, a request misunderstood. Romeo and Juliet is fiction, but it mirrors the real consequences of small, quiet failures in social systems. The families erect statues at the end, quiet, symbolic gestures. History does the same. After tragedies, societies commemorate. Monuments rise. Memorials mark time. Yet systems remain unchanged. Lessons are often absorbed emotionally rather than structurally. The play quietly reflects this pattern. Grief does not equal reform. The story makes desperation seem beautiful. Juliet's potion, Romeo's impulsive suicide. History has plenty of examples where desperation is romanticized. Adolescents in constrained societies improvising solutions. Elites interpreting risky acts as passion. Societies praising intensity over measured action. Romeo and Juliet shows this quietly, gently, and persistently. The play serves as an informal guide for understanding youth. Impulsivity is normal. Emotions are intense. Guidance is often absent. Consequences are inevitable if adults fail to act. This is a soft lesson in psychology centuries before psychology existed, and it continues to resonate because it mirrors life closely. Now, gently, let's consider the long cultural shadow. The story influenced literature, opera, film, social expectation of romance. Every adaptation carries the same quiet patterns: youth constrained, systems failing, love rushed into crisis. And audiences, for centuries, have recognized these echoes. Finally, let's rest with the idea of persistence. Verona's tragedy doesn't end. It repeats quietly, in different forms, across generations and societies. Romeo and Juliet endures because patterns endure: youth under pressure, miscommunication, adults who fail to intervene, consequences that accumulate slowly. The story is quiet. It is not loud. It is not flashy. It is sleep-inducing, patient, persistent, and ultimately reflective. Breathe. Let it settle. Let the quiet patterns drift into your mind. Verona fades. Romeo and Juliet fade. And you remain softly awake, gently aware, and slowly resting. Now, let's drift into the subtle but persistent weight of social expectation. Verona isn't just a backdrop, it's a system. Families, traditions, and honor codes constrain behavior quietly but persistently. Romeo and Juliet are not simply young lovers, they are actors in a network of expectations. This is historically accurate. Across centuries, societies have constrained youth through expectation: marriage arranged before readiness, behavior dictated by tradition, emotions suppressed or misread. And the tragedy arises quietly, inevitably, because the system refuses to bend. Teenage decisions often feel eternal. Romeo and Juliet make choices as if the world depends on them, because in their constrained environment, it does. History offers similar examples: young heirs forced into marriages, teenagers managing estates or titles, children navigating politics beyond comprehension. The quiet lesson: decisions made under pressure rarely feel small. Consequences quietly grow over time, and sometimes the world waits too late to intervene. Next, let's gently explore secrecy. The lovers' clandestine actions escalate risk. Secrecy multiplies consequences. History is full of this: couriers delayed, orders ignored, secrets misinterpreted. Romeo and Juliet's story models this phenomenon. Even well-intentioned secrecy, like Friar Laurence's plans, can amplify risk. It's quiet, it's cumulative, and it often feels inevitable in retrospect. Now let's consider tragedy as a pattern. In the story, death is not sudden. It's the natural accumulation of missteps, constraints, and delays. History mirrors this quietly. Wars often begin through small errors. Economic collapses grow from unnoticed imbalances. Family feuds escalate slowly, then suddenly. Romeo and Juliet teaches that tragedy is often predictable if you notice the subtle cues early. The story endures because it is structurally familiar: youth under pressure, systems failing, love rushed into crisis, and adults too late to intervene. Every generation recognizes this quietly. It is timeless. It is almost sleepy in its inevitability.
And each new adaptation merely reshuffles surface details while keeping the underlying machinery intact. Let's float toward perception. Romeo and Juliet equate intensity with truth.
Emotional extremes are equated with meaning. History repeatedly mirrors this. Societies praise dramatic gestures over careful action. Humans misinterpret chaos as passion. Desperation is romanticized. The quiet irony is that real-life consequences are rarely as poetic. Death, exile, grief, they are mundane, persistent, and unromantic. Now gently consider patience. The story quietly instructs, slow decisions are safer, observation is critical, intervention should be timely, not reactive. History is full of examples where patience prevents catastrophe. Romeo and Juliet illustrates the cost of acting too quickly or waiting too long. It is subtle, it is gentle, and it is sleep-inducing because the consequences unfold slowly, predictably, yet inexorably. Let's drift further. The patterns from Verona echo in centuries of literature, art, and social behavior. Miscommunication multiplies risk. Youth constrained by authority face amplified consequences. Adults intervene too late, often with only symbolic remedies. Even modern media continues these patterns. Films, television, and novels replay them quietly. Romeo and Juliet's core structure persists because it models human systems faithfully. Tragedy in the story is not loud. It does not shout. It does not need to. It moves slowly, like a tide. It accumulates consequences quietly. It demonstrates inevitability without dramatics. And this is why the story works as a sleep-inducing meditation. You can observe every small cause, every tiny ripple, and feel the quiet progression toward conclusion. Finally, let's rest with the ultimate lesson. Romeo and Juliet is not about passion. It is about structure. It is about inevitability. It is about consequences quietly accumulating when guidance is absent. The story endures because humans recognize the pattern. Youth constrained, adults failing softly, small miscommunications accumulating into tragedy. And as we drift into the final calm, breathe. Let the streets of Verona settle. Let the tomb remain silent. Let the whispering lessons of human behavior gently lull you toward rest. No dramatic flourish, no excitement, just reflection, patience, and quiet observation. Sleep now. Now let's gently consider how stories preserve patterns of history. Romeo and Juliet is more than fiction. It's a microcosm of recurring human behavior. Systems fail, youth are constrained, small missteps amplify, and history repeats quietly, often unnoticed until tragedy emerges. The story doesn't dramatize history, it observes it, slowly, patiently, and that is part of its enduring power. Let's drift back to the young lovers. Teenagers are impulsive, brains still developing, emotions intense, decision-making limited. Juliet's daring choices, Romeo's rashness, not romantic heroism, not rebellion for its own sake, simply human responses to intense social constraints. And history is full of similar examples, children acting within constrained systems, consequences quiet, accumulating, inevitable. Now let's focus on minutia. Romeo happens to encounter Juliet. The letter is delayed. Friar Laurence acts cautiously but incompletely. History is full of such details quietly directing outcomes. Tiny decisions can ripple into life-altering consequences. The story teaches that observing small details matters, small failures matter, and quiet incremental change, or lack thereof, can shape destinies. Verona itself is a character. Streets narrow, families entrenched, honor prioritize over empathy. Cities and societies often function like this. Social structures quietly constrain individuals. Tragedy arises not from overt villainy, but from the soft pressures of systems in motion. Romeo and Juliet mirrors these dynamics gently, letting them unfold naturally for the audience to observe. Now consider fate. Romeo and Juliet often feels like destiny, yet it is a combination of choice and circumstance. Every small action, running away, hiding letters, impulsive suicide, interacts with circumstance, and the result is tragic. History mirrors this subtle interplay. Individuals make choices, societies constrain them, outcomes emerge slowly and quietly, often tragically. The story quietly informs culture for centuries. It teaches love should be intense, youth will make mistakes, adults may fail, consequences accumulate. This structure persists across literature, theater, opera, and film. Even modern adaptations, whether teen dramas or cinematic epics, preserve the same subtle patterns, and audiences recognize it instinctively, quietly internalizing the lessons. Let's drift toward miscommunication again. Letters undelivered, intentions misunderstood, plans incompletely executed. Romeo and Juliet demonstrates gently that quiet failures in communication can have disproportionate consequences. History mirrors this perfectly. Diplomatic letters delayed, orders misread, warnings ignored. Small mistakes quietly accumulate until systems collapse. Now gently consider impulse. Romeo kills Tybalt, Juliet consumes the potion. Not calculated, not heroic, impulsive human reactions to intense social and emotional pressure. History echoes this quietly. Young people making irreversible choices under constraint, systems failing to provide guidance, and consequences quietly compounding over time. Adults in the story are not villains. They are cautious, reactive, sometimes indifferent. Friar Laurence, the prince, the parents, they all fail softly. History is full of similar figures, leaders who act too late, guardians who defer decisions, institutions that hope for the best. Tragedy arises not from malice, but from quiet inaction. Finally, in this stretch, let's rest with the ultimate endurance of the story.
Romeo and Juliet endures because it models patterns humans recognize. Youth under pressure, systems slow to respond, small miscommunications accumulating, adults intervening too late. It whispers rather than shouts. It teaches rather than entertains. It endures because quiet observation is sometimes more powerful than spectacle. Breathe. Let the quiet lessons settle. Let Verona
Fade. Let Romeo and Juliet exist softly in memory. And drift, slowly, toward rest. Now, let's drift into the environment of Verona. The city itself isn't hostile. It's structured. Rules, honor, and social norms quietly constrain behavior. Romeo and Juliet navigate not just each other, but this system. And history mirrors this. Young people rarely act in isolation. They operate within networks, familial, societal, political. Small pressures quietly accumulate, shaping outcomes without anyone noticing until it's too late. Let's consider human error. Romeo and Juliet act impulsively. Adults act cautiously but incompletely. And so the quiet mistakes compound. History is full of this pattern. Decisions made under partial knowledge. Warnings ignored. Assumptions untested. The story teaches that even small errors left unchecked can quietly escalate into tragedy. Timing is everything. Juliet awakens moments too late. Romeo arrives moments too early. Small differences in timing, soft, almost invisible, determine outcomes. History shows similar patterns. A messenger delayed by rain. A battle postponed by hours. A critical choice made one day too late. Romeo and Juliet teaches that timing, subtle as it is, quietly governs consequences. The story operates in a quiet economy of emotion. Every act of love has a cost. Every secret carries weight. Every impulsive action demands repayment. This mirrors historical reality. Emotion, when constrained by society, gains disproportionate power. Romantic acts are calculated not by passion alone, but by social consequences. And yet the story portrays this gently, almost hypnotically. Let's reflect on secrecy. The lovers' clandestine meetings escalate risk. Friar Laurence's plan adds complexity. History mirrors this. Secrets rarely stay small. Even well-intentioned concealment can amplify consequences, quietly. Romeo and Juliet demonstrates that secrecy, when combined with impulsivity and constrained systems, quietly multiplies risk until it becomes tragedy. The story is filled with quiet irony. Romeo's impulsive violence stems from grief. Juliet's calculated courage stems from desperation. Friar Laurence's caution leads to miscommunication. History loves similar ironies. Decisions intended to prevent harm often magnify it. Actions intended to preserve order quietly destabilize it. The irony is gentle, persistent, and slightly amusing if one is awake enough to notice.
Now, let's drift to the story's endurance. Romeo and Juliet has appeared in plays, operas, films, teen dramas. Each medium preserves the same subtle patterns: youth under pressure, systems failing, love rushed into crisis, adults intervening too late. And every generation recognizes these echoes, quietly, instinctively. The story's power isn't spectacle. It's observation. It notices human behavior patiently. Impulsive youth, cautious adults, accumulating consequences, miscommunication. By observing rather than dramatizing, the story endures. Its quietness is its strength. Let's gently reflect on lessons. The story encourages patience, observation, early intervention. It suggests that care, timely, thoughtful, proactive care, can prevent quiet tragedies. And history validates this. Small, early actions often avert disasters that appear inevitable in hindsight. Romeo and Juliet dramatizes the cost of neglect, softly, hypnotically, persistently. Finally, let's rest in reflection. Romeo and Juliet is not about passion alone. It is about systems, constraints, miscommunication, accumulating consequences, youth navigating adult expectations. The story whispers rather than shouts. It teaches quietly, subtly, gently. It endures because it models life realistically, rhythmically, softly. Breathe. Let Verona fade. Let the tomb remain silent. Let the story settle, softly, persistently, like a gentle lullaby. And now, as the story drifts fully into quiet observation, you may rest. Sleep, slowly. Now, let's drift into family. Capulets and Montagues, both proud, both constrained by honor. Neither actively seeks tragedy, but the structure of their families ensures it. History mirrors this pattern. Families often enforce systems quietly, without malice, that constrain youth. Arranged marriages, expectations of obedience, enforcement of reputation. The quiet power of family shapes the story as much as love does. Romeo and Juliet are young, and age matters. Adolescents experience emotion intensely, act impulsively, and misjudge consequences. History is full of similar patterns. Teen rulers making life or death decisions. Young heirs navigating complex social networks. Adolescents improvising solutions to impossible problems. The tragedy is amplified not by evil, but by youth constrained within structured systems. Let's consider cause and effect gently. A delayed letter, a chance encounter, a secret plan misexecuted. Each small failure quietly amplifies risk. Each allows the soft constraints of family, society, and age to escalate quietly into tragedy. The story is filled with quiet irony. Each quiet failure adds to the tension, drifting toward inevitable tragedy.
History is full of this.
Wars start because someone misreads a letter. Dynasties collapse because of minor miscommunication. Small errors quietly become monumental. Romeo and Juliet demonstrates this softly, almost hypnotically. The story compresses time, emotion escalates, actions are intensified. This mirrors historical reality when social constraints press on young people. Every choice feels urgent. Every emotion feels amplified. Every failure carries weight beyond understanding. Romeo and Juliet models this gently, without dramatizing overtly. Now, consider adults again. Friar Laurence, the prince, the parents. None are villains. All fail softly. History shows the same. Leaders acting late, guardians hesitating, institutions hoping for the best. The story quietly demonstrates that tragedy often arises from inaction rather than malice. Letters undelivered, warnings ignored, intentions misread. Romeo and Juliet is structured around small accumulating miscommunications. History mirrors this pattern. Diplomatic errors, misinterpreted orders, delayed messages. Consequences ripple quietly. Systems fail softly, and tragedy emerges without spectacle. Friar Laurence plans carefully. Romeo and Juliet improvise, and yet the plan fails. History is filled with similar ironies. Decisions intended to prevent harm often amplify it. Systems designed to stabilize quietly destabilize. The story whispers this truth. Human plans are fragile when systems and emotions interact. The story endures because it encodes patterns, not events. Youth under constraint, adults failing softly, miscommunication multiplying risk, consequences accumulating. Every adaptation, every cultural iteration preserves these patterns, and audiences quietly recognize them. Romeo and Juliet teaches observation, not spectacle. Impulsive youth, adults acting late, systems quietly enforcing behavior, small errors accumulating into tragedy. The story's rhythm, calm and reflective, models human systems more than romance, and this is why it endures, century after century. Finally, we drift toward closure. Romeo and Juliet is not just a story of love, it is a reflection on constraints, consequences, youth navigating structured societies, adults acting too late. Its lessons whisper, they don't shout, they teach quietly, gently, sleepily. Breathe, let Verona fade, let the lover's story settle softly, and drift into rest, slowly, persistently, like the quietest good night. Now, let's drift into risk. Romeo and Juliet take risks quietly, almost imperceptibly, meeting in secret, sending messages, defying social expectations. History mirrors this pattern. People take small risks within constrained systems. Every action carries invisible consequences, and often it's the accumulation of tiny risks rather than one dramatic act that produces tragedy. The story teaches this gently, hypnotically, without shouting. Constraints are often catalysts for creativity. Romeo and Juliet improvise. They navigate narrow paths, hidden corridors, and secret plans. Historically, this is true as well. Young heirs finding clever ways to navigate courts, teenagers improvising solutions when adults fail, communities adapting quietly under social restrictions. The story models ingenuity under pressure softly and consistently. Every decision carries weight. Romeo kills Tybalt. Juliet drinks the potion. Small, simple actions accumulate into irreversible outcomes. History mirrors this accumulation. A minor misstep in diplomacy leads to war. A subtle error in family succession destabilizes a dynasty. A quiet misunderstanding escalates across generations. Romeo and Juliet demonstrates this pattern slowly, almost hypnotically. Now, let's drift toward the story's enduring structure. Patterns repeat quietly. Youth constrained by adults. Impulsive action meets rigid social norms. Miscommunication multiplies risk. Adults intervene too late. This structure persists across literature, opera, film, and drama. Each generation recognizes it instinctively, quietly, without needing to read the original text. The story compresses emotional intensity into a short time span. Juliet's courage, Romeo's impulsiveness. Social pressure heightens the emotional stakes. History mirrors this. Adolescents under strict social constraints feel amplified emotion. Every decision carries disproportionate weight, and consequences quietly accumulate. Romeo and Juliet models this softly, hypnotically. Timing governs outcomes more than passion. Romeo and Juliet act at the wrong moments. Letters delayed, meetings misaligned, plans executed too slowly. History mirrors this subtlety. Messengers delayed, orders misread, critical choices made slightly too late. Timing, though small and quiet, often determines success or tragedy.
The story whispers this lesson gently, almost imperceptibly. Adults are not villains. They are cautious, reactive, and sometimes absent. Friar Laurence, the prince, the parents, they all act imperfectly. History reflects this. Leaders act too late. Guardians defer decisions. Institutions hope for the best. The quiet pattern of adult inaction amplifies the consequences of youthful choices. Secrecy plays a central role. Romeo and Juliet's clandestine plans multiply risk. Friar Laurence's careful concealment unintentionally escalates consequences. History mirrors this quietly. Secrets rarely remain contained. Even well-intentioned concealment can amplify consequences. The story models this gently, letting us observe rather than react. Romeo and Juliet endures because it models human behavior, not events. Patterns repeat, youth under pressure, adults failing softly, small mistakes multiplying consequences. Every adaptation, film, opera, novel, drama, retains these core structures. Audiences for centuries recognize these patterns instinctively. Finally, we rest. Romeo and Juliet is not about loud passion or spectacle. It is about structure, constraint, consequence, youth navigating adult systems, adults intervening too late. The story whispers rather than shouts. It teaches quietly, softly, persistently. It endures because it models life realistically, rhythmically, gently. Breathe, let Verona fade, let the tomb remain silent, let the story settle, softly, persistently, like the quietest lullaby. Drift, slowly, persistently, sleep. Now let's drift into impulsivity. Romeo and Juliet act quickly, without deliberation. Their decisions, though human, quietly escalate into tragedy. History mirrors this pattern. Young rulers making quick judgments, teenagers navigating impossible expectations, small mistakes accumulating into monumental consequences. The story teaches that impulsivity is neither heroic nor evil, simply consequential. The city of Verona exerts invisible pressure. Social norms, family honor, and rigid expectations quietly shape behavior. History reflects this quietly. Societies constrain youth with rules, traditions, and expectations. Small acts of rebellion carry hidden costs. Systems rarely bend for individuals. Romeo and Juliet shows the gentle, persistent force of societal constraints on personal choice. Miscommunication quietly drives the story. A delayed letter, a misread plan, whispered secrets. History mirrors this. Diplomatic errors, misinterpreted commands, social messages lost in transit. Consequences accumulate imperceptibly until tragedy emerges softly but inevitably. The story's power is not spectacle. It observes human behavior patiently, impulsive youth, adults acting late, accumulating consequences, miscommunication multiplying risk. This quiet observation is what gives the story enduring resonance. It whispers lessons rather than shouting them. Every act carries weight. Romeo kills Tybalt. Juliet takes the potion. Small, simple actions quietly accumulate into irreversible outcomes. History shows the same. Minor missteps escalate. Small errors ripple across generations. Quiet failures compound. The story models this patiently, rhythmically, persistently. The story endures because it models behavior, not events. Patterns quietly repeat. Youth constrained by adults. Miscommunication multiplying risk. Adults intervening too late. Audiences instinctively recognize these patterns, and so the story persists quietly across centuries. Timing governs outcomes more than passion. Letters delayed, meetings misaligned, plans executed too slowly. History mirrors this. Messengers delayed, orders misread, critical choices made one day too late. The story whispers the subtle importance of timing, softly, hypnotically. Adults are neither heroes nor villains. Friar Laurence, the prince, the parents all act imperfectly. History shows the same. Leaders hesitate, guardians defer, institutions hope for the best. The quiet failure of adult intervention amplifies the consequences of youthful choices. Finally, we arrive at quiet closure. Romeo and Juliet is not about spectacle. It is about structure, constraint, consequences quietly accumulating, youth navigating adult systems, adults intervening too late. The story whispers rather than shouts. It teaches softly, gently, persistently. Breathe. Let Verona fade. Let the lovers rest. Let the story settle, softly, persistently, like the quietest lullaby. Drift, slowly, persistently, into calm, sleep.